Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why big exercises, and generally the bigger an exercise is, the lower of reps we should train that movement, and why I mostly these days train in the 1 to 3 rep range on my big exercises. Although not exclusively, I have exercises I do 10s, 15s, 20, 25 reps. But for my big movements, I tend to stick to mostly the 1 to 3 rep range, with some of those as accessory movements I might do as high as 6 to 8, things like chin-ups and stuff. But I tend to stick with low reps, and the reason for it has to do with training quality of reps, staying within our maximum recoverable volume on our big muscle groups. Because what people need to remember when we're talking about the bigger muscles in the body, the data, the literature, the experts who look at it have noted that it simply takes more time for bigger muscles to recover. And your biggest muscles in your body have usually a finite amount of recovery resources available to them. And therefore, we need to be very selective with our training volume. And when I talk about this in terms of really low reps, I don't mean that this needs to be always done. I don't mean that there aren't exceptions, and I don't mean that you can't even periodize phases of training where you do different rep ranges, and there's nothing wrong with that. What I'm talking about is the majority of your year, there's a certain amount of benefit to sticking with very low reps, even when you're trying to hit certain amounts of volume. Because at the end of the day, we need to remember, volume is the primary driver of hypertrophy. Total volume, but that volume also has a weight component to it. It's not just reps and sets. And we know when you look at all the literature out there that very low reps, when the volume is equated, produce just as much muscle growth as higher reps. But what we're looking at is the strength end of it. Whereas conversely, when you're dealing with single joint exercises, for example, their hypertrophy seems to correlate with strength in almost a one-to-one fashion. Like if you lock someone into a machine and you measure their machine strength, you're going to see a direct carryover from hypertrophy to their 5 rep max or 10 rep max or whatever, when you're talking about like a machine leg extension or a locked in machine curl to where your arm is kind of strapped down to a bench and only your elbow can move. You're going to find that that's the case. But when we're dealing with big multi-joint exercises, there's a neuromuscular component and a neuromuscular learning to our strength. And that strength will absolutely affect your hypertrophy, and it will even affect your carryover to the smaller movements. And so accordingly, we need to be thinking in terms of maximum strength output with these big exercises. And we need to be careful about junk volume, because it's one thing to have junk volume on a face pull or a leg curl or something that's a smaller single joint type exercise or a smaller movement. We don't really run into the same overtraining problems and limited recovery issues that we do on really big exercises with junk volume. And so I would argue that we need as many quality reps as we can recover from. And quality reps usually require lower rep ranges if we're trying to induce long-term hypertrophy. And even then, we can run into fatigue problems even when we're lifting heavy for even equivalent amounts of volume. There can be fatigue associated with it, even in the literature that shows equal growth. So this is something we're always fighting with. It's training stress versus fatigue and recovery. And our big exercises, this is absolutely important. Whereas I would say there's smaller stuff, and I need to do a follow-up video on that, just discussing smaller movements and higher rep ranges. But generally, you're not going to have the same problems with junk volume that you will on a face pull or a ab crunch that you're going to have from a squat, a bench press, a push press, a deadlift. Like junk volume is a problem. It's a big problem. So reps that accumulate recovery fatigue that don't have a training effect, you don't want to do that many of those. So we can run into real problems when we start dealing with 10 reps, 12 reps, things like that. So what we find is that when you do lower reps and we focus on explosiveness and we focus on form, we focus upon maximum strength on these bigger exercises, we get more practice at our first reps. In other words, even if you're going to do an equivalent amount of volume, like let's say you want to do 30 reps in a training session, well, 10 sets of 3 gives you a lot more practice on your first reps, more practice on the setup, more practice doing a first rep, which is going to carry over better to maximum strength. And it's going to improve the general strength as well. In other words, you're going to get stronger over a period of weeks or months, just slightly stronger than had you tried to do equivalent amounts of volume and got fairly equivalent amounts of hypertrophy from higher reps. You get better practice with executing the exercise. And what people need to understand is that big exercises are very heavily reliant upon learning the motor pattern, learning the form, learning the technique, and you need a certain amount of practice with that to get good at them. And you need that if you want to get stronger faster. And that's a big part of hypertrophy. It's just one thing to talk about maximum strength, which is definitely what I'm all about. But even from a hypertrophy perspective, you need to maximize strength on those big exercises, right? You need to maximize strength on a bench press or a dip or a standing press or a squat or a deadlift variation. I don't care whether it's a deficit deadlift, a sumo deadlift, a conventional deadlift, any of those hip hinges off the floor. You need to be maximizing the amount of tension that you can generate per set because that affects your training volume to a very, very large extent on these exercises that are capable of putting the most size on you. But you've got to remember they have a limited amount of recovery that they can handle. All right? You run into recovery issues if you're not careful on these, so doing junk volume is not ideal. We really need to be maximizing tension. And again, that requires motor unit learning. It requires more practice. It requires more quality reps. And you're going to get more quality reps and better strength by doing lower reps, even if that means using the same weight, even if you're using your 8 rep or 10 rep max for lower reps, but you're focusing on speed and technique and power and just doing more sets. You're going to get better strength carryover. You're going to get better strength outcomes, and you're going to get more practice at perfecting your reps and your form. All right, this is important. It's very important on these big exercises. Now, again, that's why I probably need to do a follow-up video of explaining why that doesn't matter as much for smaller exercises, and why for smaller exercises we aren't as worried about jump volume and we're not as worried about learning a motor pattern. But we are on the big movements. And when you're doing these big movements, first reps matter a lot. Weight on the bar matters a lot. Consistent form matters a lot. So a lot of it has to do with the fact that there is a learning curve with all of these exercises, and you need to practice it more. That affects your strength because it's not just hypertrophy, right? The amount of weight that you can bench press, yes, the muscles in your pecs, your anterior delts, your triceps, all of that, they matter. They matter a lot. They matter tremendously for how much you can bench press. And I don't just mean your 1 rep max, but I mean your 5 rep max, your 8 rep max, right? It matters to all of that. But the motor pattern matters. And that's why some accessory movements carry over better than others. That's why a JM press, for example, or a weighted dip improves your tricep strength better on a bench press than, say, just a single joint skull crusher does, or single joint tricep press down. And it's not to say that tricep hypertrophy doesn't carry over. It does. It just doesn't carry over quite as well because it's not involving a motor unit learning. It's not involving a movement pattern. And these movement patterns, when multiple joints come into play, matter. And that practice matters. It affects strength outcomes, and that affects your ability to generate workload. It affects it. And that is always best achieved when we do lower reps. And even if you look at that classic study that Schoenfeld did a couple years ago, that's what he had found. Now, he argued that there were fatigue issues with it, and that's a little more subjective. But what they found was that 7 sets of 3 with equated volume to 3 sets of 10 on these big exercises produced the same hypertrophy, even though there were slightly less reps because total volume was equal as far as tonnage. But they also improved strength slightly more on all the big exercises. So they got the same hypertrophy with a little more strength. And I would argue that in the long term, when you're looking at the long-term progress of that strength gain 6 months down the road, a year down the road, is going to equal to even more hypertrophy. So again, the weight on the bar matters. The practicing the heavy reps matters. The amount of weight that you're moving matters. Practicing your setup matters. it affects this stuff tremendously. And so I tend to push people in that direction, that you get stronger faster with less junk volume that you have recovery issues from by doing it this way. And if you want to get higher reps and more volume in beyond your big exercises, that's where you can do supplemental work that's best suited for the higher reps. But your big exercises, I would tell people you need to train heavy. And by heavy, I mean 1 to 5 rep range for more advanced lifters, and even for novice lifters who I wouldn't necessarily put on those even in the 5 to 8 rep range, because that's going to be heavy for them. So it is somewhat relative to how advanced you are. But again, the point is big exercises need to be done with heavy weight for low reps, even if you're trying to push the volume up high. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.